Good morning. Welcome to the Digital Hollywood panel about everything. At least everything about financing and valuing all the general media categories. Officially, it's valuing and financing entertainment content, movies, television, and online video from VC and equity to crowdfunding. So, like I said, we're going to pretty much cover the waterfront. And we have a top-notch panel to do that. And what I'm going to do is, just to get things started, have them each give us their 30-second elevator pitch about who they are, what they do, and their perspective on life, or at least life in the media. We'll start down at the end with Diane McGrath.
Hi, I'm Diane McGrath. I run a media and tech practice for a 105-year-old investment bank down on Wall Street. We look at all levels of entertainment projects. We de-risk them by adding technology components to that. The level at which we fund is pretty much all over the place. We work with private companies, public companies, content creators, owners, libraries of IP. It's more or less the secret sauce that we put together that attracts the capital, protects the content owner, protects the rights, and helps everybody participate in the multiple revenue buckets that we orchestrate across the properties.
Hi, Peg Jackson with Moreland Partners. We're a technology-focused investment bank. I help head up the digital media group. We have about a 50-person firm, London, New York, San Francisco. So while we're technology-focused, there's been a really interesting trend, as we all know, in the last couple of years about the media and the content part intersecting with technology in a whole new way, where now you're starting to see venture funds and to a degree some growth funds that would never entertain going into direct rich media, now understanding it better and exploring that. I think we're going to talk about that a little bit. But it's a really exciting time in terms of how Moreland sees it. We help raise capital, $20 million or higher rounds for firms, and we help sell companies in the valuation ranges of 20 to 400 million.
Pat?
Patrick Russo. I'm a partner at Shamrock Capital. We are a private equity fund that was founded over just about 40 years ago by Roy Disney as a family office originally, and steadily evolved over time from a traditional family office to a traditional institutionally backed private equity fund that we are today. We have $1.8 billion of assets under management and invest exclusively in media, entertainment, and communications through two fund strategies. One is our core private equity fund. It's our fourth private equity fund, which is $700 million. And that invests exclusively in media, entertainment, and communications companies that we define as lower middle market. So typically investing anywhere from $20 million to up to $150 million or more. And a second fund that we raised last year, which is $250 million, designed to acquire and own content, film, television, music, games, all sorts of IP that have been released. They've been through that initial window of release. So whether it's 3 months old, 3 years old, or 30 years old, we're somewhat indifferent to that, and we're capturing a yield or a return for our investors through the ownership of IP.
Oh, by the way, I have one instruction for all of us on the panel. All of us need to talk almost directly into the mics, so just to eliminate feedback and so everybody can hear. But Sky?
Good morning.
That
Well
works.
done.
Hey.
I'm Sky Moore. I'm a partner at Strzok & Levin, a law firm. I'm head of the entertainment department, and I am the author of a book called The Biz, which is an overview of the business side of the film industry, and if you don't have it, you should get it. So here's the product placement portion of our program. I also have a channel on YouTube. If you search my name, Sky Moore, you'll find a whole channel of a course I teach on film financing. And for the hardcore people, I have a separate treatise called Taxation of the Entertainment Industry, and I'm on Twitter and everywhere else. And if you'd like to subscribe to, I have a newsletter that I send out, and what I do is I always, after seminars, leave a contact sheet. If you want to contact me or be added to my email list, it'll be up here, so that if you want to figure out who I am later on.
Thank you. Seth?
Awesome. Hi, I'm Seth Shapiro. I've been in digital media tech development for over 20 years. Disney, Comcast, Goldman Sachs, DirecTV, a bunch of companies. Mainly, these days it's kind of on the buy side and the sell side, so working with investors to find promising things, but then also helping to develop startups or later stage companies positioned for those partnerships. The last 5 years, there was, as everybody knows, a lot of work in OTT, SVOD development, and that became a global business, so that's been really interesting as more catalogs look to sort of unlock value and go direct to consumer. And now, still doing that, that's sort of my day job, and doing sort of old school carriage agreements with major distributors, but you know, the big growth in the money that's flowing into this town has a lot to do with AR and VR, so I'm spending a lot of time with that and enjoying it.
And I'm Larry Gerbrandt. I've been doing this panel now at Digital Hollywood for 10 years, spring and fall, and it's the same panel, pretty much the same title, and sometimes the same panelist, and just keeps getting better. I've been doing it long enough that I started out as a blonde, and I went through my gray period, and now I'm in the white hair crowd.
You're back to the blonde.
Everything comes around. I started my career basically in the production business, making TV commercials and industrial films, but 20 years at Kagan, followed by a stint running a division of Nielsen, and since 2007, I've had my own practice, Media Valuation Partners, doing valuations, as the title suggests, and also a fair amount of litigation support work, and writing business plans for startup companies, and doing photography on the side. I don't know quite how that
A
happened.
world-class photographer.
Absolutely.
Glad that.
Thank you, thank you. Actually, I just got back from a 7-day expedition to the Upper Peninsula, what they call the UP of Michigan. Amazing fall color, amazing part of the country that a lot of people never get to see. So I use photography as an excuse to travel interesting places. Anyway, in prepping for this, trying to get my head around, what do we want to talk about, at least to kickstart the conversation, something crossed my desk that made me perk up even more than usual. And it was a data point that the Millennials, this is the age group that are 18 to 34 in 2015, are now the largest single demographic. They are the core audience. It's where most of us in the audience used to be that group, the baby boomers. We've been demoted to number 2, mostly because we're getting older and disappearing. But the millennials are really, they've begun to take over. They've begun to take leadership positions in business, or at least they're starting their careers. They're actually moving out of mom and dad's basement and buying homes, or at least we hope they will, because that'll spur the economy. But more fundamentally, they're changing the way media is consumed and doing it in a way that is radically different from, I still remember 6-inch black and white TV sets, okay? And the picture kind of flickered, and we had something called an antenna, rabbit ears, and all fiddly things on the roof. And now it's, this thing is where the future lies. So the question for the panel, just to get things started, and I'll start with Seth and we'll move down, is that the 18 to 34 demographic has always been the sweet spot for advertisers, and therefore for ad-supported television. But this generation of millennials appears to be consuming media and video in particular in fundamentally different ways than the boomer generation and even Generation X. How has the emergence of the millennial TV viewer affected the television series economic model, and by default, the way TV series are financed?
That's a really good question. So two just things, data points from my own personal experience about why you can't ignore this and why it's so inevitable. I launched TiVo at DirecTV about 15 years ago. It was the first major DVR platform, and as we studied behavior, one of the fascinating things was noticing kids who, after having a DVR in their house, would go to grandma's house and say, I want to watch SpongeBob. And grandma would say, honey, SpongeBob's not on yet. And the kid would burst into tears and say, grandma's TV is busted, I want to go home. not understanding that there had been a linear schedule ever, right? So, those kids are automatically if you grew up in a world where you weren't forced to watch things linearly in appointment television, you're going to really resent any time that you're forced to do it. The next generation of that we saw was as the first tablets came out, and you've probably all seen it. If you have little kids going up to the TV and swiping them and not understanding why they can't select. So actually, I'll plug my book. I teach at USC, and I'd started to write a book on why this is sort of the peak TV era, how it happened, interviewing, the heads of the networks. And what I realized was you couldn't really tell that story without going back to the beginning. And what was fascinating is this stuff has been happening more or less since the beginning. TV was this absurd concept that nobody believed in. It was like traveling to Mars or building jetpacks. And the folks who moved to monitor consumer behavior and really innovate, each had their own way of dealing with these generational shifts, but they've always been there. And I think the sort of peak television for over 400 series a year that John Landgraf and everybody all talks about, that's been driven by the fact that we went from 20th century was all about constrained supply, right? So if you had 3 networks or 4 networks or even 6 or 8 networks, you dealt with what you got. But the explosion of Netflix and Amazon Prime, for examples, have opened up the model so much more that there's an excuse. You have public markets funding more and more shows. You have an increasing global class of people who can afford to consume on more and more platforms. And so that's what's been supporting this model. But the question is, how much has the user experience around that model shifted? And for those, so CBS is, maybe really to the extent that CBS has still been really successful as a broadcast network, it's because they're the demo that didn't really have to change largely, right? I think it's going to be incumbent on everybody to figure out what that new user experience is to keep people in there, because if it feels old, if it feels outmoded, this generation is not going to stick around, nor have previous generations in that case.
Sky, I know you don't do as much TV. You're more film-centric, so I'll switch the question up a little bit. How has the millennial generation changed the funding model for movies?
Well, it's impact. It says several impacts. Number one is millennials don't have the attention span for a 2-hour movie. So I would say, and the reason why studios have gone to the blockbuster approach is because that's really the only one that works. That's the only time that people will go and sit through a 2-hour movie. If you look these days at the number of films that are just disasters, to me, the film industry, in the classic sense, is really in deep trouble because there's just no bottom in terms of what a film will do. People are going out on 3,000 screens and coming up with less than $10 million. That is just a complete tragedy. So you see, I say, number one, I think films are in trouble other than the blockbusters that work. And then second is that the audience is so sophisticated in terms of advertising on the TV side that they don't accept advertisements in the classic sense anymore. And advertising and funding, therefore, has moved to become integrated into the content. And the advertisers are, in fact, now the producers of the content. And if I always think of, if you think of Red Bull, you almost think of it really as a creator of extreme sports more than you think of it as a drink. And if you look at some of the films now, Lego, Transformers, just pushed by the advertisers, content created by the advertisers, that's just a brand new world. And more, one of the odd exceptions there's government regulation of sponsorship that requires disclosure of sponsorship, but for some bizarre reason they don't require it in the context of product placement. So this is all the advertisers have moved, aggressively into this area. And then the third thing that you see in a very big way is that the need for new experiences and a whole different level of media integration, and the future is absolutely virtual reality. I mean, when you look at where it's going and what's going to happen, virtual reality will swamp our industry. It's going to completely transform us in the next few years, and the money and the content and I always tell people, you want a job guaranteed, man. Make content for VR because that's where the future is.
Our next pass down the panel, just for a heads up, you touched on something I really want to talk about, which is VR versus AR. So, and I've got my own version called ER, but we'll get there. No, it's good, it's all good. Patrick, to the extent that, how, you're a lot about raising money, investing in companies for the future. How does the millennial consumer impact your choices in terms of where dollars go?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll start off by saying I don't have a book. I didn't write a book. I didn't know that was a qualification to be a speaker. But in fairness, Larry, I do remember black and white television. I had one as well, too. So I didn't want you to think I was that young.
Increasingly exclusive club, by the way.
So I think what Sky and Seth have been touching on here is the fact that, first of all, you can't ignore the millennial demographic, right? As Larry said, it's the largest group now today. They have tremendous spending power and influence across the country, and obviously that impacts the media industry. But I think what is fundamentally happening is a few things. One, what the millennials define today as content is vastly different than what probably everyone in this room historically has defined as content. We think about content, we think about film in a traditional setting and going to the movies and sitting down and having that social experience for 2 hours and saying, I either liked it or I didn't like it. And for most of us growing up, we would go to a movie and there would be word of mouth that would eventually get around, and that movie would last for a long time typically, generally regardless of how good or bad it was. Today, within minutes of that film being released, there's a social experience that goes on, and a film can be wiped out within hours if that demographic group simply doesn't like it. The same sort
Masterminds.
Exactly. Well, good content always travels well and lasts, but you always have to start there for sure. So with television, again, a similar experience. If you have millennials in your home, just simply watch how they interact with content and how they interact with devices. And what they're defining as content is vastly different. Yes, there's a massive explosion of television content today. We'll have 450 scripted shows on the air. Next year, we'll have over 500. There's a 9% increase across all platforms, broadcast, cable, premium cable, and OTT last year, and that will continue to happen this year. But as a content creator, in many ways, in order to tap into that audience, you have to be indifferent as to how your story gets told. And instead of defining yourself as a TV producer or a film producer or an over-the-top producer or a digital content producer, you're a premium content player. And you have to deliver that content to an audience that wants it in a very different way. And what might work or start in a digital environment, maybe at the end of the day, the conclusion gets told in a 2-hour, blockbuster tentpole film, but you have to evolve to the market, and I think that's what we're seeing fundamentally. This isn't an industry that stands still. We all know that, right? As Seth said, when television came out, it was, well, I don't know, no one knew what it was. I mean, when the VCR came out, Jack Valente said famously, who was head of the MPAA, the VCR is as much a friend to Hollywood as the Boston Strangler is to a woman home alone. And well, the VCR became a massive source of cash and value for the entertainment industry. And just like new platforms are coming on board today, there's a shift and a recalibration or a reallocation of value in how stories and content gets told and delivered. And for us as investors, we're constantly studying, looking down the road, where do we see a bend in the road? What are the implications for those bends? And where do we want to invest?
Okay. Peg?
Yeah, so, we're talking audience flow, right? Key question. When I did business development at NBC, Thursday night NBC was a science, right? It's very different today, right? A lot of millennials, certainly the kids under that, don't understand networks as well, don't tune into it as well. And you have this sort of plethora of content that they're, constantly trying to discover. It's interesting you say about film. I think one thing I notice in terms of some viewing habits is that the life of a film could have a different meaning today, in the sense that obviously Netflix could be friend or foe to a lot of film producers, but the ability, I see a lot of that millennial generation watching a lot more film than necessarily TV episodes, right? So their definition of what they're viewing and how they're viewing obviously are very different. But I do think when you look at the lifespan of content in terms of revenue streams, it's quite different than, say, 5 years ago. The other thing that's interesting to what Patrick's looking at in terms of, my understanding of some of the rights and the IP, I had an interesting experience of a bunch of middle school kids. We found Little House on the Prairie, and honestly, we had a binge watching of, 4 hours of Little House on the Prairie, paid her $20 or whatever, found it on Apple TV. That's stuff you hadn't seen in 10, 15 years, but yet it still works for a generation that's new. And I do think for quality content, there's a long life shelf as long as there's, a wave for discovery. And so I think, having experts in the area that continue to look at how to navigate content coming and getting exposed, including old IP, is going to be a really interesting revenue stream in the future.
Diane?
So I said earlier when I introduced myself, we look at content and projects a little bit differently because of the complexity of rights and everything associated with most stages of content. But we start further back, so either it's older IP or it's new IP that's being created by, obviously, by the content creators, and how the funding of these projects is different in relation to the millennials. Is obviously that's a huge component, is what's the mobile strategy. When we look at numbers that we have with projects that are over in China or India, where mobile consumption of entertainment is far different, there aren't credit cards, there is not a plethora of big screens, and the small screen is basically the device that's used. So we look at a strategy, or we help them create a strategy of what continues for past the typical broadcast of any project. So what's the mobile? Is there a gaming strategy? Is there a commerce strategy? What's the protection of IP along those buckets? How do we, like I said before, how do we protect the content creator in that? And so that in return, then, so the revenue keeps on going, because when we talk to investors and they say, in the case of film, well, we're not going to see any revenue for 2 years. That's not interesting. So how do we de-risk that? How do we get the revenue in earlier? So we have strategies for that. And it's all based on the millennial. So we help create a different strategy to get that audience stickier.
Okay, thank you. I mentioned a couple minutes ago that we were going to talk about VR and AR, and I said, and I was going to throw in ER. ER is enhanced reality. To me, that's really that's the superset. We all know what the traditional media looks like, and even the new media still follows the traditional two-dimensional. We know 3D didn't work. We're now back to 2D TV. Virtual reality, though, has become Tim Cook has actually dismissed it to some extent and said where Apple's future is in augmented reality. That probably has a lot to do with the kind of device that that company makes. But I know the hot buzzwords in Hollywood has been the creation of VR content. Yet we still don't have either an economic model that we know reliably works, or a breakout hit that sort of put everybody, that says, okay, this is where the future and what it looks like. So, Seth, I know you've been spending a lot of time in that world.
Yeah, I'll go first. For those of you who are around at the time or are spending a lot of time in VR, AR now, I'll tell you exactly what it is. This is 1991, and we're waiting for the first good browsers, and everybody is saying what a ridiculous thing it is that content's ever going to be distributed on computers, that's not where content lives, and you've got a stronger and stronger sort of relatively small but durable community. How many of you have actually had like a kind of road to Damascus moment where you saw something in VR and said, wow, I get it now? So if you want, I got to do the smart thing that Sky did, but if you email me at info@sethshapiro.com, we have a paper that sort of can give you a list of them. But if you see something that's really good, you'll get it. No matter what I say, you're not going to believe me. But there's something about being an experience where for some small period of time, and it can even be just a few seconds, you forget that you're not experiencing something very real. Your neurology believes it's real. Your body believes it's real. I'll give you a quick example. There's a project called the Walk VR, which is done by Create Advertising. in Culver. It was associated with the Joe Gordon-Levitt movie about Philippe Petit, the guy who walked between the two World Trade Centers, okay? So in this VR experience, and this one's actually a little old, so it's not even necessarily the new tech, but you're wearing a headset and you walk across this cut hose. And they don't do this anymore because they're afraid to. They'll put a fan behind you. And then you go here and you're on Tower 1 and you look down and there's New York and you set out to walk through to Tower 2. Here's the thing that's amazing. 1/3 of the people who put this on, even though they know they're in a conference room, even though they know they're in a building, in a very safe place, they cannot do it. Because their physiology is so convinced that it's real. So if you think about the implications of that, not just for entertainment, but for phobias and different modalities and distance learning and training and travel, all of these things. VR will happen when and I'll do the VR AR thing real quick too. But the short version is virtual reality is going to happen regardless of what happens in media because it's such a compelling way to sell and replace products in so many other fields like travel and education. The difference between VR and AR is, for those of you who've seen a headset, you have this thing, it's like a big visor that sits on your head. You're leaving this reality and going into another one. And again, if you send me an email, I'll send you a list of some good ones to see, but you can find clips of a lot of them online. Augmented reality, to Larry's point on the other hand, is where we put another layer on top of this one. So if you haven't seen what that looks like, a great thing to do is to go to YouTube and look up Magic Leap, and you'll see examples of that. So just some quick ones. In the future, I could look at Brad and whatever device calculation, whether they're glasses or whatever, will tell me this is Brad, you met him on this day, here are the days that you had phone calls, here's his wife's birthday, etc. That's one big application. All of the database stuff that happens down here can now happen out in your field of vision. Computer monitors will be virtual. You'll have a keyboard here. All the monitors will be up there, but they won't be real and nobody else will be able to see them. All of the things that could be displayed on a traditional monitor will be displayed out here in your field of vision, and it makes sense that's what Apple's more interested in. It makes sense that's what a lot of companies are more interested in because it's sort of a bigger field. I mean, it's sort of changing everything that can happen in sort of the current computing platform, and instead of doing it here, you're doing it out in the world gesturally. So that's sort of the big picture on AR.
Yeah, I've heard that one of Apple's projects is they're actually going to turn the iPhone, in effect, transparent, so that instead of putting on a goggle, you hold it up and you're seeing through the iPhone, and and it overlays another reality or an augmented reality.
Yeah, and like from an economic perspective, I'll give you one example, then I'll shut up. There was a company about 7 years ago. I used to have an office in Amsterdam, and there was a company called Layar, L-A-Y-A-R. Did anybody ever see them? So what they did, and this is way before anybody was talking about this stuff, is they had an app exactly like what Larry's talking about, and you'd walk through the streets of Amsterdam and you'd see exactly what you were looking at, except anything that was for rent or sale, it would tell you this one's open, they're showing it on Sunday, it's €1 million. You go down like this one closed yesterday, here's the realtor. So basically, the device becomes a field into another layer of reality on top of this one. They sold to Google.
Well, and also I think in AR you see a lot more of the business-to-business applications, right?
Yeah.
That's where there's dollars, there tends to be a lot of movement in the market. So that's why when you talk to more of the financial people and some investors a little bit more, I don't want to say bullish, but they look at augmented reality as more of some case studies and business studies that can drive revenue, and augmented reality definitely has much more of the entertainment angle.
Sky, when are we going to see VR movies from a major studio?
They're there. I got to experience. Fox is really at the lead of this, and I got to be Matt Damon on The Martian as the Martian, and it's just fantastic because they have a whole lab that's set up, and coming soon to a theater near you or to a headset near you. So the studio, why they're going to do it is the trademark value alone. If you're going to go and do a VR experience, if you pick, for example, Star Wars, you instantly get what's going to happen, or The Martian, you get what's going to happen. So they're going to monetize, they're going to be at the forefront. I would just say two things on this. The AR, the leading experience right now is Pokemon, because that's absolutely AR, and it just burst out of nowhere and monetized, found a fantastic monetization model. So that's one thing. But I'm a big believer in what I think will happen is location-based VR. I think that it will not be it will not work at home as well because of motion sickness. You get motion sickness when and you can't stand up and you can't walk around because it's dangerous actually to be at home doing it. But if you're at a location-based, you wear a pack, and I've done this, and it's fantastic because you walk through this entire experience and you're there. And what I believe is going to happen is that theaters will ultimately convert to location-based VR experiences, and what you'll do is you'll walk through. It'll be, instead of a 2-hour experience, maybe a 20-minute experience, but you'll pay more than you do now for a movie ticket, and it's an incredible experience because you can go with a friend, and what a fantastic date! Rather than going to a stupid movie and a dinner, you go and you can be in an alien world, or go to thousands of years ago, or whatever the experience is. And if you go online, you can see there's a company that does this called thevoid.com, and you can see what they do. And I've gone there in Utah, and they have a beta, and the monetization that will happen is they'll just be charging admission, and the first place it's going to happen is at theme parks. And you can guarantee Disney's going to be all over this because they've got the content, they've got the trademarks, and they've got the theme park. So that's I expect to really boom.
Patrick, are you financing any AR, VR companies?
Well, for us, the answer is no at this point, largely because we're not venture capital investors. We're not early stage. We tend to be late stage growth equity investors. So while we've seen and observed many, many companies, both here in Los Angeles and across the country and internationally around this sector, and it's something we're very focused on, the challenge for us simply is the stage in which those companies are in, which are often pre-revenue and are currently at valuations that you have to scratch your head at. Now, we recognize the opportunity. We know that there's significant value to come. It's a function of when and where. And we look at it and say, well, we certainly can see opportunities from a VR or AR perspective in education. You can imagine your children or your grandchildren sitting in a boat crossing the Potomac River with Washington. That's an incredible experience, and it should be the direction in which many parts of education should go and will go over time. And there are companies that are making those investments today. But again, early stage. Do we see opportunities in healthcare and corporate training? Absolutely, but still early stage. When we look at it from a traditional entertainment perspective, other than location-based entertainment, what Sky's talking about, I don't envision anytime soon an environment where you're paying whatever, $25, and you're putting the glasses on and you're watching a 2-hour movie sitting there trying to experience something that may be entirely overwhelming to you emotionally, psychologically, on many, many levels, let alone there's still lots of questions about VR and AR and the implications for younger children. So I think we're ways off from that perspective. I think marketing concepts like go to the Martian experience in VR at some theme park, that makes a lot of sense. That's ways to extend your brand, your IP, but I don't think we're quite at that moment just yet, and we're certainly not ready to make those investments as a private equity firm.
Peg?
Yeah, I mean, I think also, again, I look at the blend of technology with media a lot of times. Microsoft's trying to throw their hat in the game. I actually was at one of their stores, and I don't know if have any of you tried out their new VR system. You go in, you have to $800-900, right? And you have to hang, bring it home. You have to hang 2 cameras in the back of the room, and it's this very not easy to set up. So when we go back to your point of it being like Prodigy or early days of the internet where the picture is slowly coming up on the screen, it kind of feels like that with VR where there's so much hurdle in terms of getting the experience. I think when we talk about Pokemon and mobile, that's a key thing to take into account. It's easy access worldwide, it has components using the phone. I think it's, until they make a much bigger jump in terms of hardware, making it easy, solve some of the motion issues, there's some big hurdles there. And then you spend this $800, and then the content, you could probably plow through in a day practically. But you don't underestimate people like Microsoft and Apple and the big hardware developers to break through it at some point. So I think it's a market timing issue. If you're an investor today looking at some of that, I completely agree with Patrick. It's early days. Marketing timing seems a little tough. 10 years from now, who knows?
Diane, any
Pretty
last
much
thoughts?
the same as Patrick has stated. We don't really directly invest in VR, but we do have clients that are studios that when they pull together their use of proceeds, there's an expansion program for VR. So, and it's typically short-form content. Part of it is they can't come up with the adoption model, the hurdle for the device and pricing, the revenue model, which is pretty critical. So it looks like a marketing expense. So in some degree, yes, but not directly into VR just because of those hurdles identified. But obviously, it does provide a great thing, and I think that we all agree that the other sectors outside of entertainment may be the things that drive the experiences forward first.
Okay, let's delve a little deeper now into the actual structure of some of the deals. The sources of financing, two of the biggest markets for millennials, as well as where we've seen a lot of capital being deployed, are China and India, especially coming into the U.S. And I'll open this up. I'll start with Sky, but I'll open it up to anybody on the panel. And that is have we peaked in terms of international money coming in, or are we just seeing the tip of the iceberg? Or let's take the global temperature on investing in media.
The answer is that for the next few years, it's China. China. It's absolutely going to, and it's still building, and you'll know it will crest when at least 2 U.S. studios have been bought by Chinese companies. then we'll know that we've hit the peak.
And then go bankrupt and are bought by VC firms and then go spin out public again.
Maybe. If the key, you can just see every day you read about Chinese investment in Hollywood, and it's overwhelming. And to tell you what's driving it is the truth of what's driving it is the Chinese stock market, because they're valuing companies completely irrationally. It's completely untethered to EBITDA or earnings, and what they love are recognizable names. And so what really sells, if the combination of factors would be the following: a recognizable name. That can be the name of a big actor, a big director, Spielberg, a studio, but something that the Chinese populace, the investors, would recognize. If you have a project that's a wonderful project, but you're not a name, forget it. It's just not going to happen. Second, they would love to have large budget English language films that will work as Chinese co-productions. And it's kind of loose what qualifies as a Chinese co-production. It needs a Chinese theme. It doesn't even need to be shot in China. We did Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon 2, and it was shot in New Zealand, but it qualified. Now, I've got clients doing a few others that are really just remakes of American films, but with a plot that's either in China or sometimes Chinese actors or just some China theme. So they love that. They love expertise. If you can bring expertise to them, knowledge, learning. Wanda just built that huge studio. They want to train their crews. They want to train their directors. So anybody who wants full employment, go to China, because they will pay you dearly for your expertise. They want to transmit ultimately their ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is absolutely, notwithstanding the lovely speech by the president of Wanda yesterday, is absolutely to replace Hollywood. Okay, in their heart of hearts, they want to bury us, and they want to be Hollywood, and they want to project their soft power around the world the same way we have projected our soft power around the world for the last 100 years. And they've seen how successful it was for America, and they want to do the same. And so if you can tap into that and find a way that they've got a fantastic history and culture and mythology, and if you can tap into that and find and help, rightfully so, they're proud of their heritage, and find themes that work and films that work. So you find a name, you find co-productions, you find something that supports Chinese soft power, that projects their history, their culture. They want theatrical films because China is theatrical films, then it falls off a cliff. There is no ancillary market. There's no video. The truth is VOD and everything is just pennies. So it just doesn't work. So they want big budget English language theatrical films that will work around the world, not just in China. Because again, they want to project the soft power around. And this is going to be a wave for at least 3 years, and it's going to be a big wave, and it's going to culminate in either building a studio or buying a studio or 1 or 2 studios.
I'll give you without drawing any specific conclusions. I don't know if you were with me but there were a whole series of Chinese VC delegations that have been in LA in the last 3 months around VR. Really knowledgeable folks, and so I was with a couple companies that build essentially sort of kiosks where you can go into this cone or this sort of, think about like a more elaborate phone booth where you can go into this thing and you can do all these kind of experiences that we're talking about, but this thing can go anywhere. And so I'm with these 2 companies that do this, and I meet this young guy from China who's in the same business. The difference is there are thousands of these in China already. So in Chinese malls, VR arcades, they already exist. It's $5 for this experience, maybe less for this experience. So they're eager to get more and more content there. And what kind of interested me about it is that business hasn't even started here. So I feel like it does kind of speak to the to the upward mobility of the Chinese entrepreneurial consumer class that's out there, that's going to malls. I mean, the mall business here isn't necessarily so great. And so if you're a VR producer, if you've got a good experience, I mean, I generally try to introduce those folks to the Chinese distributors because there's just more options for distribution for that stuff in China than there is here.
Anybody else on the
Yeah,
Chinese?
I'd just say from a financing perspective, Moreland, we have 10 Mandarin-speaking colleagues. We spend a lot of time there, a little bit more in the robotics area than necessarily just the digital media side. But the big change I've seen over the last year is you've seen, Alibaba, some of the big name strategics putting in their, dabbling money around the U.S. in various areas in technology and media. The big shift in the last year has been on the growth private equity front. From new funds that are developed over there. There's a big urge to get money outside of China, and they see the U.S. investing in the media and technology area here as an important way of getting the money out and investing in businesses. I've just gotten a lot more phone calls from these funds recently around, not necessarily virtual reality, but around the companies that are, the Crunchyroll type stuff, the OTT type stuff. There's definitely more of an educational learning curve, but if the companies have any sort of scale, north of 20 million revenue or some profitability, that have some financial metrics, the valuations you can get over there are just almost 30-40% higher than what you see here. There's a company, AppLovin, that just got $1 billion acquisition from one of these funds over there. It does mobile marketing, but there's no way that would have happened here in the U.S. So I think there's a lot of good opportunity as the finance evolves out there, as they get more educated for developing areas like virtual reality and new types of OTT, et cetera.
We see
Diane?
some funding going back and forth between companies that are creating co-productions both in China, but then there's a U.S. co-production sister company that goes hand in hand. So content is going both ways, just not one way. In the instance of Alibaba, I think what they're after is, because it's commerce, and going into the business of producing movies, because you're going after legacy films or legacy franchises because of the commerce component in the franchise. So that's where they're headed with that. I know that in the instance of Transformers and X-Men, that's clearly what they were after in doing. They were after those guys to own the commerce component of that, but that's their play as well. And in getting your content into China, I think that Sky was talking about that, there's SARFT, which is the censorship arm of, and is this good for our country? Does this uphold our values? Is this teachings we want? So in spite of what you're doing, you have to get through SARFT, and that's a fairly political process. Yeah. So that's a significant hurdle. Oddly enough, P&G funds most of the television shows that go into mainland China, and they're acting as pretty much the de facto standard before they get to the SARFed because of the relationship, so it's somewhat incestuous. But, so again, typical to Asia, it's navigating the relationships and substantiating the value.
Yeah, we're about to go to the audience for questions, but I want to ask anybody on the panel, and I know Sky knows this, but I'd like to hear from others as well. What's, in terms of tax credits, which have been a big source of financing here in the U.S., what's hot, what's gone cold? Or what's gone cold and and where is it heating up?
Well, I guess the hot one is now China. I mean, there was the announcement yesterday, 40%. It's unclear at what 40% of what it is they're providing, with half of that coming directly from government and the other half coming from Wanda. But that's certainly, and that's intended to get productions to this new studio that's been built and drive people there. I mean, I'm sort of out of that game, so I'm not in it as close as you are, but that certainly was the big news that came out yesterday.
Yeah, the problem is how you collect them. So even when I have a project now and it's being shot in Australia, and the bank wouldn't finance it because they weren't familiar with the process. And the tax credit component was something like $35 million. So the process, the collection, the pass-through, the cash flow of it, which we found out was 4 months if we met all these criteria, blah, blah, blah. So it's not just, oh, great, here's the percentage that you can get. It's the collection, it's the process, the capture, the coordination of probably 3 to 4 levels of people that make that happen. So is it hot? Absolutely, but it's process-driven, and it does work. So that's it, and we use that as a de-risking.
Sky?
Do you mean what's hot, not for tax credits?
For tax credit,
Got it.
what's gone cold and what's heating up?
Louisiana is cold, okay, because they put a cap on it, and it became uncertain, and so uncertainty, everyone went to Georgia. So Georgia is now hot. Australia is hot, okay, because they give an honest-to-God 40% of your budget if you make it as an Australian film. Oddly, Germany is hot because we did Snowden and Babelsberg, and you get significant money from both Babelsberg and the local government as a subsidy. Those are, I would say those are the big ones right now that are hot. The China one is, as Patrick said, is the real question is 40% starting from what and of what, so does that mean the prices are inflated and we get a discount, or is it just production costs at that studio as opposed to on the whole film, which is some of the states do? So, not that is still open. Canada's it's tried and true, but not. You get more bang for your buck actually in Georgia, Australia, or Germany.
I just got the pitch from BC. I was just up there, and it seems like it was probably a lot more compelling if you work with Canadian companies. So if you work with Canadian companies in British Columbia or Ontario, then it can be worth it. But if you're not, maybe not.
Okay, and let's go to the audience for questions. Go ahead.
Just a comment regarding the question about Wanda's incentives, because I was there last night when the chairman was explaining it, and it was clearly below the line only, local spend at the studios, so it's expenditures on stages, crew. Opposed to sure if you're a foreigner, you're probably not going to do very much of it in China. There aren't really the capabilities there that would match the West. So my calculation, I've produced movies in China, and I think it's 40%, which sounds great, but probably 40% of about 30% of your budget. So which nets out to not 10, 12, 15%, which is good. It's better than nothing.
Although the people ran, like the Great Wall ran into twice budget overruns because they didn't have the crews, right? So
yes, if you're traveling people there, it's probably a wash.
yeah,
at best.
Okay, go ahead.
This is a question I've had for a while, and it's very relevant. How do you ease investor concerns over, overexposure of currency risk in China, as well as the getting your money out of that country, as well as the political landscape there? I mean, is that an issue that you run into, and how do you deal with it? Because, I mean, I feel like that's something that the government is talking about in terms of, freedom of speech issues and overexposure to the censorship from the Chinese government. So
I'll give
Sky?
it, the quick answer is there are banks that loan outside China against Chinese credit effectively. And so that's become the biggest loophole right now, and as long as that stays in place, there's ways, it's fairly easy to get money out of China.
But, so what about hard assets, like say the new Shanghai Disney, that's something that, is a bank gonna insure you if the government decides to, make some move against
That I don't know.
I'm sure that Disney has done quite a bit to assure themselves that they're protected from a government standpoint. I mean, it's a massive investment on both sides, whether that's China, from the perspective of China, or from Disney for something like that.
Diane?
We have to launch a trade war.
It does help with the sister production companies. That's, kind of like a JV, although they're not called JVs in China, I forget what they're called. But so that helps alleviate some of that pain because the cash flowing across countries is difficult. And you're right, very problematic.
I was wondering on the evaluating content portion, which we haven't gotten into that much in this great talk so far. I'm wondering if those who work with evaluating IP and content can talk a little bit about the challenges of it and the parameters that you use. I'm a screenwriter and producer. Our little company has managed to acquire a significant amount of literary IP, science fiction genre, over 400 titles, and we're just really starting the process of figuring out how we're going to move forward with it, not as literary managers, but as owners of content and active producers, developers with partners. So I'm wondering if those of you who do these evaluations could talk about it a little bit.
I'll actually answer that a little bit and try to do it quickly. I've actually had the opportunity to do that for different kinds of IP owners. And a lot of it has to do with having some sort of output deal where you have a known economic model that you can put value something through and figure out what percentage of the library of the assets can be turned in, and then what's your likelihood of, first you look for break even and then possible profit margins and what's the hit rate. It can be done, but just you can do it as an abstract, but it becomes a completely artificial analysis. It really helps to have some sort of established pipeline that you can put things through. You have a 10-picture deal with a network, a studio, an SVOD service, or something like that that has a known economic model. That's really the basis for doing these kinds of valuations. I don't know about anybody else wants to take a crack at that.
Yeah, I think, I want to make sure I understand your question when you talk about evaluating content from a creative standpoint, or evaluating from a financial, what's it worth?
Evaluating it from a financial standpoint. There's companies like, startups like Horror Fund LLC, which there's a panel on, that are trying to crowdfund invest around some IP that they own, and I know that the company that bought Project Greenlight has done similar things, and I was just curious about what some of the evaluation models are. I've evaluated film libraries in the past.
Sure.
I've been actively involved with that, and I know what some of those standards are, but I'm wondering with literary IP, you were mentioning about that.
Yeah.
Just how you approach it, and if there really is any value around which financing can aggregate, or you have to go on the partner search, which sort of is the more, you think, productive model for IP owners?
I think that you own IP, okay? The question is it being exploited today? Is it generating any revenue or receipts to you today in its current form? That is a cash flow stream that you can understand historically, what has it done, and what are your expectations going forward based on the rights and the privileges that you have today? You can clearly forecast that. Outside of having that, if you own a right to produce a film based on a book that you have to develop into a script, you have to pitch to a studio, you have to get green light, and you have to come up with a distribution strategy, and then you have to make an expectation around how is it going to perform. So in other words, you're building, as Larry said, you're creating a plan on the basis of how many and what kind of thing and how frequently. And the challenge with that is who's the right investor for that? Well, we can build a plan, and that would imply certain valuations of around those forecasts and the potential around that. It's still centered around who's the right investor for that and who's going to take that risk, because that is a true gamble. That is venture capital in its finest form. I have ideas in my head based on IP, scripts, whatever it is. Who's going to make that investment? It's no different than I own land. I'm going to take a bet that if I drill a hole, eventually I'm going to find oil down there. And then how do you exploit it from there?
I'll tell you a really quick story just to cheer you up, and this is the God's honest truth. I don't know if you remember this. 8 years ago, Larry and I met with a friend, a guy who had been introduced to me by a friend, and I'd actually met with this guy before, and a CFO from another company was doing exactly what he was trying to do. He represented the libraries of some science fiction and fantasy writers, and he was trying to raise a fund to monetize it. I don't know if you remember this. We went back and forth. There weren't any deals in place. There wasn't anything to hook it to. He was kind of around town making that, trying to make that case, and then he sold Game of Thrones to HBO. So it doesn't work much anymore. I mean, so I wish... Yeah, Vince, yeah. So, I mean, you got to get a deal in place, but, but, I mean, it can work.
Or a relationship with somebody who has the relationships that can monetize it. Peg, did you want to?
Or the other thing is that I know we clearly look at the rights.
Yeah, that's
So that's the biggest piece. The rights surrounding the property. You're mentioning literary rights. How many buckets does it own? Can you participate in past that? I mean, the thing that happens with technology.
I mean the film and TV rights to all these.
Yeah, but if we have other extensions, if there's a gaming component, if there's I've had some clients where they've found we've introduced different technologies that introduce a new format, and that allows them to re-copyright, re-trademark. So if there's a back-end rev share based on rights that they're sharing, they push it to another format, they don't have to participate. So it's largely around, the rights exploitation, what you own, what you have to share, new technology, new formats that allows you a leg up on it. So and I think the term you were talking about is called valuation. And in banking, investment banking, there's usually like 5 levels of that. Hardly any of them apply to this stuff and what we're talking about, because technology has just pushed the envelope so much further now. And most rights don't apply to it. So it's kind of, open game for this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I was supposed to say, depending on when you got the rights to the literary.
We've reached our end time, sorry. Peg, was there a comment? Okay. I'm really sorry. They're giving me the high sign that we have to end the panel. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming and the panel for contributing.
Oh, really? That's funny.
That's it.
Hi.
You should get to go to New York. Okay.